In April of 1941, as German panzers rolled across the Balkans like an unstoppable tide of steel, a small garrison of Greek soldiers received orders that would transform them into legends. They were to hold a narrow mountain pass against an entire German division. The odds were beyond impossible, roughly 300 defenders against 30,000 of Hitler's finest troops. Their commander asked how long they were expected to hold. The answer came back, as long as possible. No one expected them to survive. This is the story of the Battle of the Pindus Gorges, a last stand so desperate and so defiant that it would earn these men a place among the most heroic defenders in military history. But unlike the ancient Spartans at Thermopylae, whose sacrifice has been celebrated for millennia, these modern warriors have been largely forgotten by the world beyond Greece. Their story deserves to be told. The year 1941 had begun with dark certainty. Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, a perfectly calibrated war machine that combined tactical brilliance with overwhelming force. Now Hitler's attention had turned southward, toward the Balkans, a strategic necessity before the planned invasion of the Soviet Union could begin. Greece had already been at war for months, fighting off an Italian invasion from Albania with surprising success. The Greeks had not only stopped Mussolini's forces but had driven them back into Albanian territory, humiliating the Duce and forcing Hitler to intervene. Operation Marita, the German invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia, was launched on April 6, 1941. It was not expected to take long. The German 12th Army, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm List, struck with precision and overwhelming power. Yugoslav resistance collapsed within days. Greek and British Commonwealth forces, though fighting bravely, were simply outmatched by German air superiority, armor, and tactical coordination. The Greek army, exhausted from months of fighting the Italians and equipped with outdated weapons, faced an impossible situation. Retreat was ordered. The goal now was not victory but survival, to evacuate as many troops as possible and deny the Germans a complete triumph. But retreats require time. Someone had to slow the German advance, to buy precious hours and days for the main forces to withdraw southward toward evacuation points. Mountain passes became the natural defensive positions, narrow defile where geography could partially offset the enemy's numerical and technological advantages. One of these passes, cutting through the rugged Pindus Mountains in northwestern Greece, would become the setting for an extraordinary act of defiance. The pass itself was a natural fortress. Steep, rocky slopes rose on either side of a narrow road that twisted through the gorge like a serpent. Any army attempting to push through would be forced into a column, unable to deploy its full strength, vulnerable to fire from the heights. It was the kind of terrain that favored the defender, if the defender had enough ammunition, enough determination, and enough willingness to sacrifice everything. The Greek High Command selected the 5th Battalion, 41st Regiment to hold this critical position. They were not elite commandos or specially trained mountain troops. They were ordinary soldiers, many of them reservists, farmers and shopkeepers in uniform, men who had already been fighting for months. Their equipment was antiquated, rifles from the First World War, limited machine guns, almost no anti-tank weapons. Against them would come the full weight of a German mountain division, supported by armor, artillery, and the Luftwaffe. The battalion commander, whose name history has preserved with honor, understood exactly what was being asked. This was not a delaying action in the conventional sense. This was a sacrifice. His men would hold until they were overrun, until their ammunition ran out, until they were killed or captured. There would be no relief, no reinforcements, no miraculous rescue. They were being asked to die so that others might live. He gathered his officers and explained the situation with brutal honesty. Then he gave each man a choice: stay and fight, or withdraw now, no questions asked, no shame attached. In an age of conscription and military discipline, this was an extraordinary offer. These men could leave. They could survive. History records that not a single soldier accepted. Every man chose to stay. As the Germans approached, unaware of what awaited them in the mountains, the Greek defenders prepared their positions. They dug foxholes into the rocky soil, positioned their few machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire, and distributed what little ammunition they had. They did not have enough bullets for a prolonged battle. They would have to make every shot count. The stage was set. In the ancient world, 300 Spartans had held Thermopylae for 3 days against the Persian Empire, buying time for Greece to rally and eventually triumph. Now, 24 centuries later, 300 Greeks would make their own stand in these mountains, facing a different empire but animated by the same spirit. They did not expect to win. They expected to die well. To understand why these men fought with such determination, one must understand what Greece itself meant in the spring of 1941, and what the German invasion represented not just militarily but spiritually. Greece had achieved independence from the Ottoman Empire barely a century earlier, in a struggle that had captured the imagination of Europe and inspired Philhellenes from Lord Byron to countless volunteers who came to fight for Greek freedom. The modern Greek state was built on a profound connection to its ancient past, the same land that had given birth to democracy, philosophy, and the very concept of Western civilization. This was not abstract heritage, it was living identity. Every Greek child learned of Marathon and Salamis, of Thermopylae and Plataea, of free men who had stood against tyranny and won. When Mussolini's Italy invaded Greece from Albania on October 28, 1940, the Greeks had responded with fierce resistance that shocked the world. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Greek forces not only stopped the Italian advance but counterattacked, driving deep into Albanian territory. Through the brutal winter of 1940–41, Greek soldiers fought in mountain conditions that were almost unbearable, often without adequate winter clothing or supplies, and they won. For a few brief months, Greece stood as proof that the Axis powers could be beaten. But the Italian humiliation forced Hitler's hand. He could not allow his ally to be defeated by a small Balkan nation. More importantly, he needed to secure his southern flank before launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union planned for summer 1941. Greece had to be conquered, and quickly. The German forces that entered Greece in April 1941 were among the most formidable military units the world had ever seen. The mountain divisions were specially trained for alpine warfare, equipped with the latest weapons, supported by the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt fighters. These were the same forces that had smashed through France's supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, that had pioneered the blitzkrieg tactics now studied in every military academy. They were professional, experienced, and utterly confident. The German 12th Army's advance through Yugoslavia and into Greece was a textbook demonstration of modern mobile warfare. Armor punched through defensive lines, aircraft destroyed anything that attempted to concentrate forces, and infantry mopped up resistance with brutal efficiency. The Yugoslav army collapsed in 11 days. Greek forces, already exhausted from months of fighting the Italians and now facing a far more dangerous enemy, fell back in fighting retreat. British and Commonwealth forces, primarily Australian and New Zealand divisions, had been rushed to Greece in March 1941 in an attempt to shore up the defense. It was a gallant gesture but strategically futile. The Germans had air superiority, better tanks, and overwhelming numbers. Within days of the invasion's start, it became clear that Greece could not be held. The question became how to conduct an orderly retreat and evacuation, how to save as many soldiers as possible from death or captivity. This was the context in which the Greek High Command made its desperate calculations. Every day of delay was precious. Every hour that German forces were pinned down or slowed meant more soldiers reaching the evacuation beaches, more men who might live to fight another day. The Pindus Pass offered a chance to impose such a delay, but only if someone was willing to pay the price. The Fifth Battalion, 41st Regiment had been in continuous action against the Italians for months. They were tired men, wearing threadbare uniforms, carrying rifles that their grandfathers might have used. They had almost no anti-tank weapons, limited ammunition, and no hope of resupply. Their artillery support consisted of a few obsolete field guns with a handful of shells. By any rational military calculation, they could not hold against a full German division. But rational military calculation did not account for the human spirit, for the willingness of men to die for something larger than themselves. The Greeks understood, in a way that perhaps only those who have been conquered and freed can understand, what occupation meant. They had lived under Ottoman rule for 4 centuries. They had won their freedom at tremendous cost. Now another empire threatened to enslave them, an empire that was in some ways more terrible than anything that had come before. The German army approaching the Pindus Pass had already demonstrated its character in Poland, in France, in Yugoslavia. The Wehrmacht might claim to be a professional military force, distinct from the SS and its atrocities, but Greek civilians had already experienced the reality of German occupation, arbitrary executions, mass reprisals, the destruction of villages suspected of harboring resistance. The Greeks knew what awaited their country under Nazi rule. So when the battalion commander asked his men to stay and fight a hopeless battle, he was not asking them to die for abstractions. He was asking them to die so that other Greeks might escape, might survive to continue the fight, might live to see their country free again. He was asking them to become part of a tradition that stretched back millennia, to join the ranks of those who had stood at Thermopylae and said to tyranny, no further. The men who chose to stay, and again, every single one did, came from villages scattered across Greece. They were shepherds and fishermen, clerks and farmers, students whose education had been interrupted by war. Some were as young as 18, others were in their 40s, veterans of earlier conflicts. What united them was not military prowess but moral clarity. They understood what was at stake. They understood what they were choosing. As the German columns approached, confidence radiating from every precisely organized unit, these Greek soldiers prepared to teach the Wehrmacht a lesson it would not forget. The German mountain division that approached the Pindus Pass in mid-April 1941 had every reason for confidence. They had swept through Yugoslavia with minimal resistance, and the Greek front was collapsing everywhere they engaged. Their intelligence indicated only light defensive forces ahead, nothing that could seriously impede their advance. The pass itself was noted as a potential choke point, but mountain divisions were trained precisely for such terrain. They expected to clear it within hours. The road through the gorge was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. On either side, steep slopes rose sharply, covered with rocks, scrub vegetation, and scattered trees, terrain that made flanking maneuvers difficult but provided excellent defensive positions. The Greeks had spent their preparation time well, creating concealed fighting positions on the heights, zeroing in their limited machine guns to cover the killing zone below, and preparing obstacles to slow any attempted breakthrough. The first German probe came on the morning of April 15th. A reconnaissance unit, moving cautiously but not expecting serious resistance, entered the gorge. The Greeks held their fire, letting the Germans penetrate deeper into the pass. Discipline held. Fingers rested on triggers, but no one fired. The German column advanced further, confidence growing with each meter that passed without contact. Then the Greeks opened fire. The effect was devastating. Machine gun fire raked the column from multiple positions on the heights. Rifle fire erupted from concealed positions among the rocks. The Germans, caught in the open on the narrow road with no cover, took heavy casualties in the first minutes. Vehicles blocked the road as they were hit. Men scrambled for whatever shelter they could find, pressing against the cliff faces, trying to return fire against enemies they could barely see. The German unit fell back, leaving their dead and wounded behind. It had been a small probe, easily repulsed, but it revealed the truth that would define the coming battle. The Greeks were well positioned, determined, and accurate with their fire. This would not be the quick breakthrough the Germans had anticipated. German doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and combined arms tactics. Artillery was brought forward, and throughout the afternoon, shells hammered the Greek positions. The defenders crouched in their foxholes as explosions tore at the rocky slopes, showering them with stone fragments and dirt. Some positions were obliterated, killing their occupants. Others survived through luck and the protection of the terrain itself. The Greeks had no artillery capable of responding. They could only endure. As dusk approached, German infantry attempted an assault. Multiple companies moved forward under covering fire, attempting to overwhelm the Greek positions through sheer numbers. The attack was coordinated and professional, exactly the kind of operation the Wehrmacht executed with practiced efficiency across Europe. But the terrain and the Greeks' determination blunted the assault. Attackers trying to climb the slopes found themselves exposed to fire from positions they had not spotted. The narrow front prevented the Germans from bringing their numerical superiority to bear. Only so many men could advance at once. Greek machine gunners, conserving their limited ammunition, waited until German formations bunched together before opening fire. When attackers got close to Greek positions, bitter close-quarters fighting erupted, bayonets and grenades and desperate hand-to-hand combat on the rocky slopes. As darkness fell, the Germans withdrew to regroup. They had gained no ground. The pass remained blocked. Behind the German lines, officers conferred with growing frustration. This was supposed to be a simple clearing operation, a minor delay at worst. Instead, they had encountered serious resistance from an enemy who showed no sign of yielding. The Greeks used the night to redistribute ammunition, tend to their wounded, and repair damaged positions. They had lost men, every German assault had cost lives, but the line had held. Their battalion commander moved among the positions, checking on his troops, offering what encouragement he could. Everyone knew this was just the beginning. The real tests would come with daylight. April 16th dawned clear and cold. The Germans resumed their attack with increased intensity. Artillery bombardment began at first light, heavier than the previous day's fire. Stuka dive bombers appeared overhead, their distinctive sirens wailing as they plunged toward Greek positions. Bombs exploded along the ridge lines, sending up columns of smoke and debris. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the bombardment. Then came the infantry assaults, multiple waves attacking different points simultaneously, trying to find a weak spot in the Greek defenses. German mountain troops were excellent soldiers, trained to fight in precisely this kind of terrain. They used covering fire, smoke grenades, and tactical movement to advance under pressure. Some German units managed to establish footholds on the lower slopes, positions from which they could engage the Greek defenders more effectively. The fighting devolved into a grinding, bloody struggle for individual positions. Greeks who ran out of ammunition for their machine guns picked up rifles. When rifle ammunition ran low, they used captured German weapons. Wounded men who could still fight remained in their positions. The battalion commander, recognizing that certain positions had become untenable, authorized tactical withdrawals to secondary defensive lines, but only when absolutely necessary. Every meter yielded was a meter the Germans gained. By afternoon of the second day, the Greeks had been pushed back from some of their forward positions. The Germans had advanced perhaps 100 meters into the pass, at the cost of scores of casualties. Their frustration was mounting. This small Greek force was imposing a delay far beyond what any reasonable assessment would have predicted. Every hour spent trying to force this pass was an hour the main Greek forces were using to retreat further south. But the Greek situation was becoming desperate. Ammunition was running critically low. Casualties mounted with each assault. Medical supplies were exhausted. Food and water were scarce. Yet still they held. When German officers, respecting the courage of their opponents, sent forward a message offering honorable surrender and the right to leave the battlefield, the Greek response was unambiguous: no. The battle continued. Through April 17th and into the 18th, the Germans hammered at the Greek positions with artillery, air strikes, and repeated infantry assaults. The defenders' perimeter contracted as losses mounted and ammunition dwindled. Individual positions fought until overrun, then the survivors fell back to the next line. There was no panic, no rout, only a disciplined, grinding defense that made the Germans pay for every meter. By the morning of April 19th, the situation for the Greek defenders had become untenable. What had been 300 men was now perhaps 200 effectives, many of them wounded. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Some positions were down to a handful of rounds per rifle. The Germans, reinforced and reorganized, prepared for what they intended to be a final, overwhelming assault. The Wehrmacht had learned painful lessons over the previous 4 days. They had learned that these Greeks would not break, would not surrender, would fight until killed. They had learned to respect the defensive positions, to expect ambushes and fierce resistance at every turn. Most importantly, they had learned that this was not going to be resolved with anything less than maximum force. The German attack on April 19th began with the heaviest bombardment yet. Every available artillery piece, every mortar, concentrated fire on the remaining Greek positions. The bombardment lasted over an hour, a sustained battering that turned the defensive positions into a moonscape of craters and rubble. Luftwaffe bombers added to the destruction, dropping their payloads with precision on the ridge lines where the Greeks still held. When the barrage finally lifted, German infantry advanced behind a curtain of machine gun and mortar fire. This was no probe, no limited attack. This was a full-scale assault by multiple battalions, attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. The Germans had finally managed to get units into flanking positions on the heights, turning the Greeks' defensive advantages against them. The Greek defenders, deafened by the bombardment, low on ammunition, and exhausted from days of continuous combat, rose from their positions and fought back. They fired their last magazines. They threw their remaining grenades. When Germans closed with their positions, they fought with bayonets, with rocks, with anything at hand. The defense had passed beyond military tactics into something more primal, men fighting for their lives and for a cause they believed in more than life itself. Positions fell one by one. A machine gun nest on the northern slope, its crew killed to the last man, fell silent. A rifle position that had held for 4 days was overrun, its defenders fighting to the end with bayonets after their ammunition ran out. The Greek line fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, each fighting its own desperate battle. The battalion commander, seeing that the position could no longer be held, made a final decision. He ordered the handful of men who still had ammunition to concentrate in a final defensive position, while he led a desperate counterattack with the remaining forces. It was not a tactical decision calculated to change the battle's outcome. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender even when surrender would have been militarily reasonable. The counterattack pushed forward into withering German fire. Men fell with every step, but those who remained kept advancing. For a few minutes, the sheer audacity of the move actually pushed the Germans back, so surprised were they by this suicidal aggression from a force that should have been broken. But numbers and firepower eventually told. The counterattack was annihilated. By early afternoon on April 19th, organized Greek resistance in the pass had ceased. The Germans had won. They had forced the pass. They could continue their advance southward. But the victory had cost them 4 days, 4 days of bitter fighting, hundreds of casualties, and a delay that had allowed thousands of Allied soldiers to reach evacuation points and escape. German soldiers, advancing through the captured positions, found scenes that spoke to the ferocity of the defense. Greek positions littered with empty cartridge cases and dead defenders who had clearly fought to the end. Weapons that had been used until they broke. Wounded Greeks who had stayed in position to fight when they could have withdrawn. The German mountain troops, themselves elite soldiers who understood courage when they saw it, were moved by what they found. The German divisional commander, when he finally surveyed the battlefield, was reported to have said that he had never encountered such determined resistance. He ordered that Greek prisoners be treated with honor, and that the Greek dead be buried with military ceremony. This was not charity or condescension. It was recognition from one warrior culture to another that the Greeks had fought with extraordinary bravery. Of the approximately 300 Greeks who had manned the pass on April 15, fewer than 100 survived to see captivity. Most had been killed in the fighting. Some had managed to slip away during the final chaotic hours, escaping into the mountains to eventually join resistance movements. But the vast majority had stayed in their positions and fought until killed or wounded beyond the ability to continue. The survivors, taken prisoner, were marched past their German captors. Exhausted, wounded, filthy from days of combat without relief, they walked with heads high. Some German soldiers, in a gesture rare in the Wehrmacht's campaigns, saluted as the Greeks passed. They recognized what they had witnessed, not a military engagement but an act of collective sacrifice that transcended ordinary warfare. The strategic impact of the stand at Pindus Pass cannot be calculated in ground gained or lost, in casualty ratios or tactical assessments. Its impact was measured in time purchased, in lives saved elsewhere, in a moral example that would resonate through the rest of the war. The German advance continued after the fall of Pindus Pass, but the 4-day delay had achieved its purpose. The British and Commonwealth evacuation from Greece, Operation Demon, had gained precious time. Thousands of soldiers who might have been captured reached the evacuation beaches and were shipped to Crete and Egypt. Many of these men would fight again, in North Africa, in Italy, in the final campaigns that would break the Third Reich. The Greek campaign officially ended on April 30, 1941, with the German flag flying over the Acropolis in Athens. But the conquest had taken longer than Hitler planned, and had cost more than anticipated. The delay imposed by desperate stands like the one at Pindus Pass contributed to a larger strategic consequence. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was postponed by several weeks. Those weeks would prove crucial when German forces found themselves fighting in Russian winter without having achieved their objectives. The Wehrmacht would never recover from that first Russian winter. Greece itself entered a dark period. The occupation was brutal. German, Italian, and Bulgarian forces divided the country among them. Famine, reprisals, and the deportation of Greece's Jewish population to death camps marked the occupation years. But the Greek spirit, the same spirit that had animated the defenders of Pindus Pass, did not break. Resistance movements emerged, some communist, some nationalist, all determined to make the occupation costly. The mountains that had witnessed the stand of the 41st Regiment became hideouts for partisans who would fight the occupiers until liberation. The Battle of Pindus Pass never achieved the fame of Thermopylae, despite the obvious parallels. The men who fought there were not Spartans, they were ordinary Greeks, but their sacrifice was no less profound. They held impossible odds for 4 days not because they expected to win but because others needed time to escape. They died so that others might live. This is the essence of military heroism stripped of all romanticism, the deliberate choice to place oneself between danger and those you are sworn to protect, knowing the almost certain cost. After the war, Greece honored the defenders of Pindus Pass, though the full story took years to emerge. Survivors were few, and those who lived often spoke little of what they had endured. Some things are too profound for casual retelling. Monuments were eventually erected, ceremonies held, medals awarded posthumously to men who would never know they had been honored. The German soldiers who fought at Pindus Pass also remembered. In the strange way that warriors sometimes recognize each other across the lines of conflict, German veterans would later speak with respect of the Greeks who had held that pass. War memoirs and unit histories from the German mountain divisions acknowledge the exceptional resistance they encountered, though often without understanding the full context, that these Greeks were buying time with their lives, that their stand was part of a calculated sacrifice. The legacy of Pindus Pass extends beyond military history into the realm of national identity and moral philosophy. It raises questions that every generation must answer for itself. What is worth dying for? When is sacrifice necessary? How should we remember those who give everything for a cause larger than themselves? For Greece, the answer has always been clear. The men of the 41st Regiment took their place in a tradition of resistance to tyranny that defines Greek consciousness. From the hoplites at Marathon who faced the Persian Empire, to the War of Independence against the Ottomans, to the mountains of Pindus in 1941, the pattern repeats: free men choosing to fight against impossible odds rather than submit to domination. This is not militarism or glorification of war. It is the insistence that some things, freedom, dignity, the right to determine one's own fate, are worth any sacrifice. The broader lesson is more universal. The stand at Pindus Pass demonstrates that numbers, technology, and tactical superiority do not determine everything. Morale, determination, and willingness to sacrifice can force even the most powerful military forces to pay a terrible price for victory. The Wehrmacht won the battle but lost 4 days they could not afford to lose, and encountered a moral example that complicated their narrative of invincible conquest. Today, the Pindus Pass is quiet. The fortifications have long since crumbled, the scars of battle healed by decades of weather and growth. Travelers driving through the gorge rarely know that beneath these mountains lie the graves of men who fought one of the most unequal battles of the Second World War. There are no tour buses, no crowds of visitors. The site is marked, but modestly. Perhaps this is fitting. The men who died here did not seek glory. They sought only to do their duty, to buy time for their comrades, to demonstrate that Greece would not yield without resistance. In the end, the story of 300 Greeks holding off 30,000 Germans for 4 days is not about warfare. It is about human courage in its purest form, the willingness to stand when standing seems futile, to fight when fighting seems hopeless, to sacrifice everything for those who come after. It is about ordinary men who, when faced with an extraordinary moment, chose to be extraordinary. Their names are inscribed on memorials in villages across Greece. Their story is taught to Greek schoolchildren alongside Thermopylae and Marathon. They have earned their place in the long, proud, tragic history of a people who have never accepted servitude easily. The 300 Spartans of antiquity held for 3 days. The 300 Greeks of Pindus Pass held for 4. Both stands ended in defeat. Both are remembered as victories of the human spirit over mere calculation of power. This is their story. This is their monument. As long as people remember that freedom is not free, that it must sometimes be watered with blood, that there are causes worth dying for, as long as we remember these truths, the men of Pindus Pass will not have died in vain.